Please join me in welcoming to the stage Felicity Jones.
Hi, everyone.
I wanted to kick off by asking you, as someone who talks a lot about how you're very often led by character, and that's one of the most important aspects when you're choosing on signing onto a project, when you first started reading the scripts, what were some of the aspects of Amelia that really appealed to you and jumped off of the page?
Hello, everyone. I think, well, she's such a wildcat. She's such a fascinating character who she really pushes things. She pushes boundaries. I loved that there was loads of action in it. I was desperate to do another action film, having done one a few years ago, although I regretted that after making the film and getting into lots of near-death experiences. But it was, I was just drawn to her effervescence and her sort of, what I also liked about it, that it was exploring through a kind of physical journey. You're exploring her emotional dealings with grief, really, with the death of her husband. But I loved it that it was done in an entertaining action way.
And Jack Thorne, who wrote the script, has such amazing credentials. He wrote the stage play for Cursed Child. He recently did his doc materials. Is he someone who really writes in a way that the visual imagination of his mind is on the page, or did you have access to ask him questions about your character and some of the story points?
Yeah, we started off really early on, Eddie and I, and Jack and Tom Harper, the director, and Todd, the producer. It was about, I think it was a good... almost a year, I want to say a year before we started shooting, we all got together. We were in Soho in London, and we went through the script with a fine tooth comb. And Jack was incredibly collaborative. We changed things, we moved things around, things we thought didn't make sense. It was a very, very open process. So we had a lot of input in those characters very early on, which was actually really helpful. That we could, as actors, you get to know those people better than anyone, and so to be able to have a voice in that at that development stage was really, really helped.
Yeah, and because you were mentioning Tom Harper, the director, what are some of the things that he does as your director that really help you to find your moment in certain scenes, or to really find your character once you're on set and shooting?
Well, he's very tenacious, so he doesn't, and some people would call it cruelty. But I like to call it tenacity. But he just keeps going and going and pushes, and he has enough of a muscle where he doesn't have too much empathy in a good way, that he just keeps going until he gets something really raw from you. And I've seen that across a lot of his work. He gets really beautiful performances and gets inside someone, and I think that comes from his determination. He makes it feel very comfortable. Nothing's ever a problem. If you say, "Oh, I'd love to do that again," or "Can I try this a different way?" or "I don't understand," or he is very, very unjudgmental.
Because you talked about wanting to sometimes do another take, was there a certain point at your career when you started to feel more comfortable asking directors, when you really felt like you needed that extra take on set?
Well, I go backwards and forwards on that, because sometimes you ask for an extra take and it's so rubbish. And you're like, why did I ask for that? I made such a big deal about it. And then, so it depends. I think sometimes if you have to go with the moment, and if it feels like, okay, there's one more in there, even if it's for curiosity, then why not?
Yeah. And with your character being an amalgam of different women from that era, but also a little bit based on Sophie Blanchard, and then you've also got the book Falling Upwards, how much did you want to look to that source material and the actual history versus really just discovering your character for itself?
Well, I think it's really... It's fun as much as anything to kind of read as widely as possible and to get to know that world. And with Amelia, there's this woman called Sophie Blanchard, who was an aeronaut in the 18th century in France. And there's a really good book. It's a fictionalized account of a real person. So the writer has kind of embellished the biographical details that we have of her. And that was a great way for me to get inside the head of someone who is prepared to take those kind of risks. And Sophie Blanchard was one of the first women to fly solo in a gas air balloon, and she would do these big shows when she took off, and she'd set off fireworks from the basket. So she was and apparently she was quite petite. So I thought, oh, that's cool. So she was a massive sort of inspiration for Amelia Wren.
Yeah, and then I know some of your prep was also going ballooning in Germany. How did that come into play once you were on set and really understanding the logistics of the rigging and all the ropes and everything that was around you in your physical setting?
Well, the most important thing with that was this guy who teaches gas air ballooning. And a gas air balloon, it's very different. It's not like a hot air balloon, which I think mostly people are used to and have maybe done trips on, where you have the flame. There's no flame. You fill the balloon with gas, and then you sort of do it practically. You kind of do it up, and then you float away, and then it's powered by the sand that you throw out, or you pull a cord to get down. But what was most inspiring was there was this guy called Willy, who was the pilot, and it was his character, because it was the first time I'd ever done it, and he was such a maverick, and it was quite intimidating because I was new to it. And then he'd be sort of jumping on the basket as we were taking off and doing all the stuff that you see Amelia do at the beginning to poor old James. And so it was meeting him that really helped me get my head into, okay, who is someone who behaves like that? And he'd done it so often, and he was so used to it and loved it so much that he just loved the performance of the takeoff.
Did it also help once you were on set in capturing the emotion of what it actually feels like to be in that position in the sky and to bring that into your character and your performance?
Yeah, but we did. We had, for that opening sequence, we had the balloon. We had a section of it on a massive crane that could go about 2,000 feet up. So I was able to do that going up. So when I'm sort of flinging myself off and waving to the crowds, that's sort of pretty much as close as it could be to an actual takeoff.
Yeah. And then how important was the acrobat and like the physical training that you did? Because your character is incredibly physical on the balloon, and we see you climbing all over it.
Yeah, well, it was just really important early on to be able to have the sort of strength and agility to just I felt like that relationship to that basket, it had to be like, it was so second nature, and it was her friend, and it was something she'd grown up doing, and it had to be so convincing that obviously the more confidence I had in doing that, then the more convincing it would be as Amelia. And so I worked with a woman who is an acrobat, and she has worked with the Cirque du Soleil, and so I went near to where I live. They do it's circus training basically, and a lot of that is climbing up, they call it silk work, and climbing up silks and trapeze, and I was able, and there was a whole load of circus performers in there, so I could be learning and then watching those guys, and so that training was absolutely invaluable.
And it absolutely shows in all of those scenes. Did you find that training and the physicality of working with the balloon informed who your character was physically in other scenes as well? Because you're incredibly agile even when you're just in a very compressed and small space.
Yeah, well, I think it affects, depending on what you do every single day, that affects the way you move, the way you talk to people, exactly. And I think it's almost like being a dancer, being an acrobat, there's a physical confidence, which I very much wanted in the way that we see her when we have the flashbacks and they're on the ground, that she still maintains that kind of, that confidence in her stature. Yeah.
And you're still having to do all of that whilst wearing period costumes. Did you find that was a challenge that you had to push through every day?
Never again. I do not recommend wearing a corset and doing any kind. I don't know if anyone's done it here, but it is an absolute nightmare. I mean, wearing a corset is one thing, but wearing a corset and throwing yourself off a balloon, that's a whole other territory. But Alex, who does the costumes, she's amazing, but meticulous detail, and everything is as authentic as possible, down to the kind of knickerbocker things that you're wearing, and the hoops and the dresses, everything. And sometimes you're like, can we not just make it look a bit fake, Alex? You're like, no. And the corsets are, they're all beautifully kind of handmade, but there is stiff as anything and take ages to break in. But it was I think that was the hardest thing about it, actually, was the period costume. I have such empathy for those gals back then.
Do you find that, especially when you're wearing costumes that are so specific as that and so authentic, that it really helps you the moment you put your costume on in terms of discovering certain aspects about the character that you're playing?
Yeah, I think it tells you about the time, doesn't it? And it tells you about a very big gap between private and public. Because obviously in public you're forced into this position, and then privately, obviously there's a different energy or something. So I think it absolutely does. You have to believe in the costume, don't you? You know, you have to believe that person has put that on in the morning, and that helps you get into the character.
Yeah. And in terms of the stunt work that you were doing, did you find that, having done movies like Rogue One and being someone who's done a lot of stunt training, that you feel more comfortable now when you walk onto set and those challenges are facing you?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's like anything, isn't it? The more you get to do it, the more at ease you feel. But this was so different in a way. I think it was so much more, because we wanted to course this line between it being very naturalistic and we were also doing a lot of stunts. It meant that, often on these bigger films, you have a whole second unit. So there'll be a whole other stunt team doing lots of things, and then you kind of come in and just do like a move or, lift your arm or something, and you're like, great. But whereas this, it was just one crew, it was just us. And so it felt like for Eddie and I, there was a lot more kind of, we had to do it many more times, and there was a lot more kind of physical risk for us in doing it. And we're both kind of glutton for punishment, so
And having worked on the theory of everything together before, did you find coming onto this that the two of you had kind of a very natural shorthand when it came to shooting sets and knowing what tone you were both setting and how your characters were going to connect to each other?
Yes, yeah. At base you have trust, an enormous amount of trust, and I always have such respect for Eddie in his level of detail and focus and commitment, and he makes me better, because I see him doing something and I go, oh, that's such a good idea, and he doesn't stop at anything, and he is such a, it's not just a professionalism, he's not doing it for show. It's a deep, deep care for what he does. And so I always find that, and I think also, we're a bit like siblings now. We know each other so well, and I think there's probably a good, healthy bit of competition, and we just keep pushing, and we'll try things and respect each other. So, if someone's sort of mumbling something under their breath after they've done a take, then you'll pick up on that person. You'll say, what do you think? And you're like, well, I think it would be better if we did this, this, and this. And then the other person backs you up. So we're just a real team.
Is there a particular scene or a particular moment with his performance that you remember that really stood out to you from what you were talking about with the way that he really pushes himself beyond what you would expect from a scene in a moment?
Yeah, I just love, actually, one of my favorite moments is he has it's when actually Amelia Wren comes to see him, and he has this moment with his box, and he's kind of timing it and closing it. And he just rehearsed that so many times and was so meticulous, even about the design of the box, and speaking to the set design people before, and then when he does it so sort of beautifully and effortlessly done. But it's that kind of detail.
I was also reading that when you guys did the theory of everything, that you had an enjoyable jibe towards each other whenever you were shooting close-ups, that you'd love to stand off camera and be like, you'll never work again, you're a terrible actor. And is that something that you continued on this set? And what was the genesis of that originally?
Yeah, it's the best way. It gets a great performance. It was, well, that came out of, actually, we'd both done films with a lot of improv, both in the States, and that method of just going off the script and just noodling around and trying things out and throwing things out there. Because obviously, if you're behind the camera and the camera's on the other person, then you can sort of say anything and they can get rid of that later on, the track. So I always think the person who's editing it must think we're absolute loons, listen back, and there's just these actors hurling abuse at each other. It's so strange. But it's just trying to prompt something. You know what it's like when you're doing something over and over again, and it can get so boring and sort of, and you get self-conscious, or you start, and it's just to throw something out there, just to to take your mind off yourself actually, and see what happens, and you might get a response that they can then edit in that might be interesting.
And one of the interesting things about watching the two-hander consistently between the two of you is there's such a dichotomy between their motivations and their personality types. Would the two of you have conversations about how you perceived your characters and the way that you wanted to balance your personalities off of each other in scenes?
Well, we were sort of we would sometimes argue, and I'd be like, is this the characters arguing or is this Eddie and Felicity arguing? Because I couldn't always tell the difference, because sometimes James Glaisher is obviously very meticulous, and everything can be proven, and he wants to know exactly what's happening from start to finish, and then Amelia is just like, yeah, whatever, let's see what happens. And so that discourse would often occur between the two of us, both, on camera and off camera.
What was the process in terms of mapping out the scenes? Because you really are shooting the majority of an entire movie in a very small space, kind of similar to what we're sitting in right now. So how did you think about how to best utilize that space and make it feel visually interesting at every point in the film for audiences when they're finally watching it?
Well, that was a huge part of it, was how do we keep this being in this tiny basket interesting? And initially we shot half a day or something, and they had the camera outside the basket, and then Tom watched the rushes back, and he said it didn't work. It didn't somehow feel genuine. And so from that point on, they made a decision that all the camera work would be done from inside the basket. So we had George Steele, who was our DOP, in the basket with us. And so that wasn't planned. That was just spontaneously. It felt like we have to be with these characters. And it was sort of a rule that they never sort of, apart from if it's a massive wide, you don't have a perspective from outside the basket. It's always on each other for that and that claustrophobia is kind of important as well.
Did that change the way that you were thinking about your performance, especially given that the camera's right there consistently throughout?
I think it just, it made you sort of forget yourself more. It's constantly, and you build a really strong relationship with George, who was always with us. It was kind of the three of us in this basket for weeks on end. So I think it was sort of, a lot of it was handheld, so we could change things around. We weren't kind of having to stick to these moves, and it was all almost kind of slight documentary style, which means that you can change it up and be spontaneous.
And you also recreated a lot of the weather conditions that you guys were experiencing on camera. So I read that there would be a lot of wind machines going. You guys would be dipping your hands in buckets of ice water. Why was that important for you guys to have the actual physical elements recreated for you on set in that way?
It just looked more convincing. It was doing everything. I remember when we were doing some of the scenes where we were freezing cold and Tom just kept shouting, "You don't look cold enough. You look too warm." It was like, you try, mate. You can do it. And then that's when we had the idea. We're like, well, let's get a freezing cold bucket and let's plunge our hands in before. So you just get a memory of that feeling of being freezing cold. And then interestingly, playing cold is often from you think, because your hands are cold, you think about your hands, but you think about your spine, because all the nerves obviously connect to your spine. So all the coldness should be, the mental thought should be from coming out from the spine, and then that's whereas initially we were sort of, you start thinking about your hands, and then that gets you to a bad place because you don't want to be thinking about your hands. So it was just anything to make it look as convincing as possible. Yeah.
And one of the other things that you did that I also found wildly impressive was sitting in a decompression tank to understand that feeling of loss of oxygen. Did that kind of change the way that you thought about your character's speech patterns, the way that you were breathing in certain scenes?
Well, that was Eddie and Tom who went through that, and Tom said that he just totally lost it, and apparently Eddie was very together for the whole experience of the deoxygenation, but it was finding every way just to get into what it would be like to be in those extreme experiences, and these are two characters who are fighting for their lives every step of the way. So the objectives are macro, they're big.
Did you also find that it was a character that you could channel yourself into, in the sense that this is something that she's so incredibly passionate about, and obviously you have that in your approach to your craft as an actor?
Yeah, I think definitely doing something that you love, and sometimes having to fight to do that, I think I definitely shared that with her.
How many of the CGI elements did you really know about? Did you kind of see any mock-ups of what it was going to look like, or was it really just kind of trusting that the end vision was going to look a certain way?
We in terms of, there wasn't any sort of pre-viz or anything, and actually we were very lucky. Eddie and I watched many versions of the film before the final one, but it wasn't until the very end that we saw all the visual effects come together. So there was a lot of trust involved, and it's meticulous, the work that they did. You know, a lot of those visual scapes are CGI, and but it was just trusting Tom that it would all eventually come together. You know, you're looking at a blue screen and being told there's going to be a storm, and you hope that it will be at some point.
Do you look to your director differently in instances like that? Because obviously you don't know what the final version's going to look like, so you need them to give you a little bit more information, or not so much?
Yeah, I think you just can't be scared to ask questions, even if you think they're silly questions. You know, where's that? It would be things like, where's the cloud coming from again? That's there. And where, you know, you have to I like to have a really strong sense of what I'm going to be looking at eventually.
And you guys actually had a good chunk of period to rehearse, if I understand right. You had a few weeks. What were some of the important things that came out of that rehearsal process in terms of discovering your character and understanding her beats throughout the story?
Oh God, it was invaluable. I mean, it's such a luxury. It's like doing a play and then filming, 4 weeks of rehearsal. It was just so nice to really get under the surface of something. We often found there was too much dialogue in a scene, so we would cut a load of dialogue from actually being able to have the chance to do it before, rather than doing that stuff on set, which is always really stressful. We also were able to work out in the basket. We had this idea that there would be different departments. There would be James's area and there would be Amelia's area, and how they interact with that space. Even though it's it's a miniature stage, it's tiny. But even within that small space, there's all sorts of kind of power games going on, and the rehearsal time just means you're relaxed in doing that rather than trying to figure that stuff out on the day.
I also really enjoyed watching some of the flashback scenes that you do with your husband, and the fact that we never kind of see their entire relationship. We just really capture moments of it, but we feel like we really understand it. Did you decide that you wanted to develop a lot of backstory, or how did you set about thinking about that from your perspective?
Yes, I think it had to feel that it was, as you say. I mean, I think we spent about half a day doing those scenes, and we had to build a whole lifetime, a whole marriage. So part of the way was we went and had lunch together. Vincent, who plays Pierre, which is, I mean, it just getting to know each other, and I think that helps. Just that we felt very comfortable with each other. But as you say, it's a sort of sometimes it is the imagination. You really have to call on to paint that whole dynamic with them.
And I also read that on the first day of shooting, when you guys were going up in the rigged balloon that would go up in the air, that you actually had a balloon crash that happened. But in terms of perseverance and needing to push through and not allowing that to be something that you think about as a possibility again, kind of like, how did you approach moving forward and doing similar scenes the next day when you came onto set again?
Well, I just always thought of Amelia, and I thought, well, she'd do it, so I've got to buck up and do it as well. And you are, you're in that person's head for that time, and that she would just take it on the head and get on with it. But it was an extraordinary experience in terms of, because it was all new terrain. No one had done this kind of film before, so it was an adventure in every way, in the way it was shot, and everyone really had to kind of pull together to make it work. But no one really had the answers, and so in those situations there is a lot of things do happen and accidents happen because you're figuring it out in the moment.
Was there a specific piece of prep that you did for yourself, or that you generally like to do before you walk on set, that makes you feel really comfortable that you're coming in fully prepped, that you really know your character?
Yeah, well, with Amelia, it was really it would be lots of just stretching, and because I noticed with these acrobats, they're constantly they have a ballet bar and stretching, and I would listen with her because I wanted to get out of my head as well. I didn't want her to be too heady. I wanted her to be in her body, and she doesn't overthink things. So I would listen to a lot of music when I was getting ready in the morning. I'd be really kind of like run around and make sure that I felt kind of, I think she's slightly on the edge all the time. So try and create that in myself before I went onto set.
And were there any parallels that you found in playing her to when you were preparing for and playing Ruth Bader Ginsburg, just in terms of the fact that these are both two women that lived very ahead of the society that they were in, are very headstrong and will do whatever they want, no matter the consequences or no matter what society thinks?
Yeah, I mean, I always find myself looking at musicians. I always think they're always a great, looking at Katy Perry doing a concert or something, how they and sometimes you need that feeling, even if you're not playing it exactly, but you want that feeling of that power. And there's something about a musician going into a stadium and that kind of self-possession that sometimes I find looking at those videos quite helpful. And also it just gives you a different, it gives you a different way into the character after you've done your research and you've been quite bookish about it. It's nice to kind of throw in a curveball for yourself.
Was there a specific moment, either when you were preparing to play her or once you were on set, that you really felt comfortable in the fact that you fully understood who she was at that point?
Who's that with
Amelia?
With Amelia. I think it's when she's actually doing that speech right at the beginning. I sort of felt her that she really enjoys it. She enjoys the sort of the show personship of it, and there was something in doing that when I sort of I felt her in her at her most powerful.
I wanted to kind of jump back in your career a little bit to talk about some of your earlier projects, such as when you first went on and had your first credit in The Treasure Seekers. What were some of the things that you learned on set that first time that you still find really valuable and still think about to this day?
I think patience. You definitely learn it's a great quality. Things don't happen like that. You have to be able to. Sometimes my family get cross with me because they'll say something. And I'll say, sorry, I didn't hear you. And they'll say, do you ever listen to anything that we ever say? And I explained that it's because when you're on set, there's so much going on around you that you have to learn to find your own little quiet space. So you sort of have to go a bit deaf sometimes, which is not great for relationships, but or maybe it is. But it is. But definitely on set, it's learning to find, how do I find my little quiet bit of space before I, do a take. And if I chat and I'm talking about something else, then I do a take. I'm hopeless at that. Some people, I think they can just sort of be talking about cheese and then they turn around, they just switch it on. Whereas I have to slightly meditate myself into a take.
And then following that, you had a recurring role on the West Witch TV series back in the day. Were there things that you kind of learned about the ability to continue growing and developing a character as you keep playing them from that?
Yeah, I think that's a really it's a sort of different muscle playing someone. It's an interesting question. Playing someone over 2 hours and then playing them over. I mean, sometimes people doing series, on and on. But I think actually you just get more and more comfortable because you understand exactly who they are and they just sort of unfold and grow. Although I have to say for The Worst Witch, I feel like most of the acting was just in crossing my arms like this. And that was kind of the character. So I was 14. So.
And one of the other recurring roles that you did very early on in your career as well was on the radio show The Archers. But what were some of the unique challenges of voice acting versus being on screen for you at that point?
I think I think your voice is always really important. And actually, when you think of actors that you really love, it's often their voices that you recognize weirdly, that you love more than their faces. And I think voice is just, it's your, without sounding too pretentious, but so often I find it's the way into the character, the dialect, the pitch, the tone, that so much of who we are is expressed in our voices.
Yeah. And when you first went onto the West End with that face, did you have a different prep process that you thought about for theatre versus on screen, or is it really the same method for you?
It's been too long since I've done a play, which is why I'm hesitating. But I actually think the more I do it, the more similar they are. I used to think they were totally different, totally different skills. But actually, in both, you need to find a naturalism and a realism. But then there's also something really nice about enjoying language and words. I mean, often in plays, I sometimes think the writing is a bit better. So you get better words to say, because some of these plays have lasted hundreds of years for good reason. But I think at root it's got to be the character and finding the truth of that, whatever that is, and however you do that, of that person.
Yeah. And because you mentioned Like Crazy, which was the first time you were doing a movie that was so heavily improvised, what was the most daunting aspect of doing that the first time you stepped onto set and had to approach that skill set?
I think it was being, there was something about that, making that film that was very naked and very vulnerable, and very trusting of Drake, Doremus, who was directing it. But he, again, we spent a lot of time, we did a good chunk of rehearsal for that, and all went out for dinner, and he makes you feel very, very comfortable and very safe. And you figure it out as you go along. I find with improvisation, you speak a lot originally when you first do it, and then you realize, oh, actually, it works better the less I say, and you don't need to overcompensate for the silences. And we just kind of figured it out as we go along. But you have to trust the story as well. That's, and the edit will decide so much of the character's destiny.
Yeah, and I know that you were mentioning a little bit earlier about how that film influenced you and Eddie doing things in close-ups. Is it a skill set that you find really comes into play in every set that you walk into now, and that you're more open to experimenting within scenes?
Yeah, I think it depends what it is. I think everyone must find this. Every script has a different logic. And some things you read and you have to say every single word exactly as it's written, and every breath and everything. And there's a rhythm that's so tightly orchestrated that if you miss anything, then it's not going to make sense. And then other things you read and you think, actually, this doesn't need to be so scientific. It works better when, you slightly go off the line and you try something else out. And I think you want to get inside whatever, so to speak, the DNA of that writing is, and try and unlock it. But I think you can't. I find you have different methods for different things depending on what the screenplay and what the story is, or the theatre play. Yeah.
I wanted to jump into a couple of audience questions that we got. This first one is asking if you have a trick for making your green screen scenes look and feel so authentic for audience members. And he said, I felt like I was flying with you.
Oh, that's good. Any tricks? I think just asking loads of dumb questions. That's my trick. Probably going, oh, what's going to be there? Just making sure that you know exactly what you're supposed to be looking at. But it is tough. I think it's one of the hardest things, actually, doing green screen acting. And just really, it's the ultimate really of acting, isn't it? Because it's your imagination. And just seeing everything in pictures, even if it's not there, you've got to bring it about. You've got to see it for yourself.
And the next one is there anything that you found for yourself that makes you feel comfortable and confident when you walk into an audition room?
I actually find, sometimes with auditions, being sent reams and reams of scenes. And I always think, do what you can to the best of your ability. So if there's 2 scenes that you're sent and you really like them and you think they're good, do those well and excellently, rather than trying to, sometimes you're sent, like 20 pages or something and you think this is ridiculous. Own your time in that room, because that's you are allowed to do that. Don't do what you think you should do.
And in terms of the career that you've mapped for yourself and the roles that you've played, externally at least, it seems like you've really consciously playing a lot of really fascinating and very strong women. Is that something that you consciously think about, or is it really just that those have been the roles that have appealed to you and come your way?
Yeah, I think I think it's just what I'm attracted to, and when I see something on the page that feels believable and true to human experience, then I respond to it.
And looking back at the Aeronauts, is there a specific scene or moment that you felt really challenged you the most in terms of shooting it and performing it?
I think anything where I was sort of climbing up the side of the balloon or trying to swing myself into that basket. That was probably one of the hardest scenes I've ever shot, because I was supposed to be helped into the basket. You know, there was someone, a rigger was helping with the ropes to help swing me in. And then we did that a couple of times and then looked back at it and it looked so fake. And then we said, right, we've got to stop all the support and the help. And so Tom and I just said, okay, I'll just try and what would happen if I actually had to do that myself? And so that is for real. That's what happens.
And is there anything in particular that you feel like you really learned about your craft as an actor from playing this part?
I learned how much it's so much about endurance and stamina. It's such a huge part of it. It is, you know, when people say, you know, it's like being an athlete. But I really think it is. It is about the training, and that's why I hate it when actors are in any way sort of dismissed or it seems superficial. I'm like, the training and the strength of person and mind that you need to do it is immense.
Wonderful. It's such a fantastic performance and such a beautifully shot film. Thank you so much for coming out and talking about it. And thank you to all of you for coming out tonight.
Thank you for coming.